joining us as we talk about the blackout bill today that is going to be up on the House floor in less than an hour. We know that this blackout bill is going to make energy in Minnesota unaffordable. Families are actually looking at an increase of electric bills alone. If you'll see over here, $1,600 per year is going to be the increase that Minnesota families are going to be facing. Overall, when those increases hit our businesses, our grocery stores, and every area of commerce, we know families are going to be looking at over $3,900 of increased costs per year. And at a time when we have high inflation, Minnesota also has a record surplus. This is not the time to be increasing costs on Minnesotans. Overall cost to the state potentially over time would be $313 billion. This proposal, this blackout bill, is going to make energy unreliable, unsafe, and even dangerous. Energy needs to be safe. We need it in Minnesota to be reliable, and this is neither. We're facing another cold week coming up, and winter blackouts in Minnesota could be devastating. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our committee lead, Representative Chris Swedzinski.
Thank you, Leader Demuth, sorry about that. You know, I think I appreciate the time you guys are coming to visit about this. And, you know, foundationally, you know, what we have laying before us is, you know, another opportunity where Democrats are really turning a deaf ear to parts of our state that really have genuine concerns. You know, you look at the rate and the speed that this bill is moving through the committee process. Very likely we have cooperatives and municipalities that have barely even heard that this bill is moving forward, and yet a deaf ear has been turned to a lot of those interests that really, quite frankly, are very important. One of the stark differences that this bill has taken from other states is, one, it's much quicker, with really, you know, I'd like to use the analogy of Wile E. Coyote, and, you know, our state of Minnesota is the cliff, and the coyote is this policy that's going off into midair without a real solution. And, you know, regardless, you know, decisions need to be made when it comes to business and communities, and we need to hear those. And one of the biggest issues that we hear in this blackout bill is that, you know, municipals, which are have locally elected officials that make energy policy, they're being ignored in this bill, and they're being included to make sure that unelected bureaucrats have more control of their energy policy than the elected officials in their hometown. Our cooperatives, our rural cooperatives, they have directors. Those are owner-based, user-based cooperatives. Those folks who are elected by their leadership, that buy the electricity, have less to say about this bill than an unelected bureaucrat here in St. Paul. And that should worry all of us, because someday it may be another issue and another. And, you know, whenever we put policy in charge of folks that are only beholden to who might be in the governor's office is a dangerous thing. And that's what we're really concerned about, is ultimately, will electricity be cheaper in the future because of this bill? Absolutely not. Will it be more available when it comes to reliability? Absolutely not. One, the reason why that is because the technology doesn't exist. You know, if we were sitting at where we could just pull this technology off a shelf and implement it and it could happen, that'd be one thing. But we're really putting Minnesota's energy future, our economic future, and our family's future at risk. And that's why we don't support this bill. Thank you.
The blackout bill today was talked about by the DFL leaders as a way for Minnesota to lead. Frankly, it does quite the opposite. The bill here today only chooses two forms of energy for us to be going towards as a state, and that's wind and solar. If we're actually going to tackle climate change and have renewable energy in our state, we need to be utilizing an all of the above approach. The fact that ending the nuclear moratorium or advanced nuclear wasn't mentioned in this bill, along with carbon sequestration technology, is a colossal mistake. Frankly, what this bill will be doing today is making Minnesota reliant on nations around the globe that have no labor standards and no environmental standards. Minnesota, in this bill, will build a clean grid economy on the backs of child slaves in China and poor environmental regulations in Indonesia and the Congo. If Minnesota wants to lead, that is not what we need to be doing with this bill today. We need to be investing in Minnesota. The resources required to build out the energy grid to make sure that we have the supply and baseload energy to take care of Minnesotans is right here in northeastern Minnesota. The third largest deposits of copper, nickel, and cobalt that exist in the known world are only 250 miles north of this capital. And instead of investing in those resources so Minnesota could lead with not only the production and manufacturing of these new technologies, we have decided to export it around the world, where carbon emissions will be 20, 25, and 30 times higher than if we were to do it here in Minnesota. This bill is not a renewable energy standard. It's a blackout bill that's gonna move out all carbon to the other corners of the globe, away from Minnesota, so we can think that we're doing it better here. We're not. We're destroying the world. We're putting Minnesota families' lives at risk, and we're not keeping Minnesotans safe. And that is the #1 rule of government. This bill, the blackout bill, has failed to do that.
I think we have time for just a couple of questions, if there's any.
Yeah, the bill details, and it looks like there's perhaps already a structure in state law too about basically asking the commission for a delay of the standard based on these things, including, I believe, soaring costs for ratepayers and some other conditions. How do you, I guess, what's your response to that? Because wouldn't that accomplish the concern about rising costs for people and, a blackout, right? That their lights will turn off if a utility wants to argue that they can't make that standard.
Yes, I'll just make a comment before I turn it over to Representative Swedzinski to handle that a little bit more. But what I can tell you is this bill was only heard in one committee. This bill should have traveled through a number of committees that would give us an opportunity to fix what needed to be fixed and to identify the areas that maybe it is going to be okay in some, but also make the changes that needed to be done. So as you watch this legislative session, everything being rushed through, we are not doing the right thing for Minnesotans. It is not having due process. It is not allowing for public input. And so that is where we can make mistakes that unfortunately could hurt Minnesotans. And then Representative Swedzinski, if you want to just mention a little bit more about the specific question.
So, oftentimes you hear legislators talk about a one-size-fits-all. And this bill is probably a great example of a one-voice-fits-all. And there are many voices that should be at the table that are not. There are many voices that have differing opinions on this bill that do not have the voice. And, one of the particular areas that you speak to is really the off-ramps. We'd consider that an off-ramp. So under current Minnesota law, that we have a duty, the PUC has a duty to make sure that energy policy is, our energy policy and our rates, not the end bill, but the rates that are actually caused through our utility decisions, have to be 95% of the national average. And right now, we're way over that. You'll hear over and over the PUC will say, well, hey, or Democrats will say, hey, our bills are still lower. And the ability to off-ramp, we've got amendments today that says, hey, if we see brownouts, we see blackouts, that we get to pause this policy from moving forward. If we see high energy costs in real terms that do not conduct their ways with other current state law, which is 95% of the national average. Minnesota in the last 20 years used to be a leader when it came to energy cost. Today we are leading the pack and behind. And many other states have much better energy policy when it comes to cost to the end consumer. And the ability to off-ramp this really will be outstruck by the goal set. Because believe it or not, we say these are goals. Believe it or not, the PUC will take this bill and run with it and force utilities, regardless of the potential cost and the impact for the sole goal of being carbon-free.
So to be clear, from what I gather, the amendments on the floor today, that would accomplish what you think would be more stringent rules on what would allow for an off-ramp? Are you saying that you believe the off-ramp as it's written is not really enforceable or not strong enough?
Well, it all depends on what unelected bureaucrats ultimately decide. Whether they put the emphasis on the stated goals of affordability, reliability, and keeping our bills 95% of the national average, or carbon. And so when you have two dual purposes, which essentially what this bill does, unelected bureaucrats have to make a choice which one that's going to be. And so whether it's through the courts, this has to get decided. North Dakota just sent a letter to the state of Minnesota. They have deep concerns, as they have in the past when bills like this have passed, and Minnesota has proven that its ability to lose these conversations in court. That costs taxpayers money, that costs ratepayers money, and the rest. And most studies will agree that we would love if we could lock prices in today. We hear over and over that solar is the cheapest, that wind is the cheapest. Well then, why isn't it the cheapest when it comes to people's bills? And we see the opportunities for rates to absolutely climb.
Where do you get your numbers from? The 1,600 energy cost per household, the 13 billion, I think the
Yeah.
minority leader mentioned. How do you come up with that math?
Well, so it's 30, well, the 1,600 is a direct relation to where we see the estimate of an individual's rate to go up. So on average, Minnesotans' average bills have, if you've seen what Excel's ratepayers have been paying from last month and this month, we've seen a huge increase. That takes an average out of what they estimate the full increase is. And Leader Demuth mentioned $3,800, $3,900, I believe it was. And what that takes into account is those unseen costs. So we all see electric bills that come to our mailbox, and we write the check for them. As we know, whether you tax business, the tax incidence study is that 95% of increased taxes on businesses and corporations get passed on to the consumer. So whether you raise actual taxes or you create a policy that raises that business's taxes or energy costs, that also gets passed on to the consumer. And so, let's say you're making a widget X, or you're doing food manufacturing. You're making ice cream, for example, which is a highly energy consuming because you're freezing things and then keeping it cold. Those costs get put into the end product that the consumers pay. And so while we have energy prices going up, while we have grocery bills going up for folks all around the state, the last policy that we should be pursuing is one that's going to make it worse. We should be looking at opportunities to decrease the cost of doing business in Minnesota, not increase it.
Any other questions? Not, thank you.